Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, my friends. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Joanne Duklas, and this is the GDN Conversation Series. Today, we have guests around the world to talk about the focus on transformational recognition of lifelong learning. And they're going to be sharing with us today their expertise, their exemplars, and their practices and advice as we learn to unpack what this means for the work that we do to support our citizens and learners with lifelong learning. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues and ask them to say hello, starting first with Noah. Go ahead, Noah.
Hey everyone, Noah Sobe, Chief of Section for Higher Education at UNESCO. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you, Noah and David.
Hi, my name's Dave Moldoff. I'm a CEO and founder of Academy One from Philadelphia.
And then we have with us Nan.
Thank you very much for inviting us here. I'm Nan Travers, and I'm with Credential As You Go.
So I'm really grateful for you guys to take the time today. We have quite a range of audience members. I do know there's a bit of a delay on my video, so apologies for that. But I can see you in the Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them forward. We'd be pleased to weave them into the conversation as we go so that we can understand the specifics of your questions and needs as we unpack this important topic. We have behind the scenes Amalia who's supporting us, and she is going to be providing links in the chat, as are my panelists today, for further information. And we will be videotaping this particular webinar and posting it up on our website for those that wish to re-watch it or also share it with other colleagues. So don't forget, ask your questions. We are keeping an eye out, and I'll make sure your voice is heard. Without further ado, I'd like to kind of start with Nan. And I want to ask you this question. And you and I have had some really interesting conversations. You're quite the powerhouse. Nan, tell me, what has brought you to this work of transforming lifelong learning recognition practices?
Well, thank you, Joanne. So I think there's many different things that have brought me to this place. And I'm going to start with a very personal one, which is that my older brother didn't finish college, and he was one course away, and for the longest time couldn't find work because he didn't have a degree. And that really struck me. I was a bit younger, so I was a child when that happened. And it's really made me concerned about how we tend in our systems to not recognize people for what they know and can do. And as a result, I ended up really focusing in around prior learning assessment, recognition of prior learning assessment and recognition, however you term it, but really thinking about how we can recognize and assess what people know and can do and being able to credential that. After many decades in that field, we then created the Credential As You Go. And the reason that the Credential As You Go evolved was that so many people have some college and no degree, or have work that that isn't being recognized in certain ways. And we really wanted to help institutions think about how they could use incremental credentialing. The incremental credentialing is a term we're using as an overarching term for all the different kinds of credentials, but with the idea that we're constantly learning and we need to be credentialed to be recognized. And so we have, for the past 6 years, been leading in the United States a national project called Credential As You Go, helping institutions be able to have different types of credentialing to recognize people from their prior learning, from work learning, and from higher ed learning.
So I encourage you to share that link in the chat, Nan. There's lots of rich research and literature exploration at that particular website. And myself, I've taken a look, and it does help to sort of help, reshape your paradigm. We'll explore more of that in a minute. I'd like David to take a moment. And David, thank you. You're one of our patrons of the GDN. For those of you who are on the line, our patrons are critical to our success. It allows us to do the work that we do and sustain the opportunities as we build convergence around network of networks, taking vision and applying it to practice. So if there's any of you out there that is interested in learning more, Amalia will put a link in the chat, and I'm of course available. But David, tell us a little bit. What brought you? You're an author. You're an entrepreneur. You've had many successes. But what's brought you to the space of lifelong learning and helping to transform thinking here?
Well, it actually goes back to my start of my career. I was attending Drexel University in Philadelphia as a co-op student, and I was one of the first students actually co-oping for myself. I started my own company when I was 18, my first company, and I was asked to develop early scoring systems on optical scoring, the little bubbles that you filled in with a pencil. And so I developed a test scoring system called PRAISE, and that was an acronym that basically focused on acknowledging people's learning. And so I grew from that, started developing student systems. So that's really how I got into it, is developing that. And along the way, I've met a tremendous number of people building systems, everything from online systems back before even online systems were evolving. It all involved developing technology that was very innovative and approach towards learning and recognition of learning. And so when you develop student systems, they are record-keeping ledger systems that was early on, and we evolved those to learning management systems. And so over my entire 50-year career developing systems, it really is moved away from the proprietary aspects of it, developing more open source and developing systems in standards, which got me involved in PESC and RS3G and the Groningen. So full circle back, I'm right back at it. I'm still doing the same thing I was doing when I was 18.
And that's a good story. And I love the personal stories as we work to understand why we have passion for what we do. Noah, I'm so impressed with the good work that's going on in UNESCO around the conventions. I'd love to hear why you are doing this work. And then I'd like to dovetail in to give you an opportunity to kind of frame the global convention to help our audience understand its relevance to this space of lifelong learning. So maybe start with telling us a bit about yourself.
Thanks very much, Joanne. Uh, I'm happy to go over those things. I'm still sort of spinning and a thought that David prompted, am I the same person I was when I was 18 or not? When I kind of began my career, first as a university student, then as a teacher trainer, and then as a academic and a professor. So, I mean, just quickly, I came to higher education first as a professor professionally. I was on the faculty at Loyola University Chicago in an education policy studies program and a history department for close to 2 decades. And then worked at one point at UNESCO on a Futures of Education initiative, and have been in this position as Chief of Section for Higher Education since January. And I mean, honestly, Joanne and friends, it's just an incredible honor to be able to work with colleagues, governments, partners, from a place like UNESCO, where we are inspired by a real learner-centered, humanistic commitment to education and the difference that it can make in individuals' lives, in their societies, their countries, their continents, and in fact, the world. In the higher education section, one of the key pieces of work that we do is manage a set of standard-setting normative instruments that provide guidance, and in fact, for states parties that have ratified or legally binding pieces of international law around the recognition of qualifications, around quality assurance in higher education, also around access and inclusion in higher education. So the Global Convention on Higher Education, and I'll pop a link in the chat in a second to some information on it, is the first UN treaty on higher education with a global scope. It establishes universal principles for fair, transparent, non-discriminatory recognition of higher education qualifications, as well as the qualifications that give access to higher education. You know, it's I think really usefully thought of as a higher education space of policy dialogue, bringing different partners together, bringing governments together, you know, all interested in promoting inclusion, access, trust in higher education, also the mobility of students, faculty members, and researchers. And so it joins a global network of regional recognition conventions that form, you know, one of the, you know, set of what we call normative instruments through which we try and support learners, support faculty, support institutions, support the whole sector globally.
And would you say, I mean, I think I have a bit of a bias in this point, but I want your thoughts on this. Would you say that instruments like these global instruments could be a helpful jump off point locally if you're trying to convince your leadership or your policy context, the stakeholders to move towards change? Have you seen it used in that way? And is it an effective tool for that purpose, Noah?
I think so. I mean, let's take this the specific change of trying to move towards uh, broader, more substantial embrace of lifelong learning. Okay. So some notion that, you know, learning, you know, which we frame as a human right, needs to be understood as a right that persists across the lifespan, and into multiple different areas of human experience, whether that's the world of work, the world of school, the world of leisure.
Mhm.
You know, I think what let's just take the global convention does is it puts the learner at the center. It makes the recognition of a qualification, you know, really uh, sort of sorry, let me rephrase that. It places the burden of recognizing qualifications on authorities to establish whether there's a substantial difference or not between the presented qualification from another system and what's available in the system. And that means that the responsibility is no longer on the student to prove exact equivalence, but it's on the recognition authorities to make a clear case that there's a substantial difference. I mean, the basic idea being that, you know, we do recognize that education experiences, learning experiences are going to be different in different parts of the world. And that's actually desirable. That kind of diversity is what makes us strong as individuals, societies, you know, as a globe. So, I mean, by bringing sort of shared principles around requiring transparent, consistent, coherent, timely, reliable recognition of qualifications, I think you can actually quite successfully advance a lifelong learning agenda, you know, particularly because, and Nan was talking about this, you know, the global convention and UNESCO's regional conventions also emphasize the importance of recognizing prior learning, the importance of recognizing partial study, right? And they really, you know, are positioned to think about the learning as a lifelong activity. And in that sense, I think we've seen it's a very effective policy lever.
So I'm going to turn this question to Nan, and then I have a question I want to ask David. But Nan, when you think about an academic an evaluator who's actually getting in documents, micro credentials, the whole bit, and you're thinking about some of the concepts that Noah describes and what is embedded in the Global Convention, as someone who's done this before, we're trained to count credits, the inputs, to count and be very specific in some of the work, and to set aside certain documentation that doesn't directly relate. That was a very traditional way of academic credential evaluation, but it's also somewhat common, et cetera. Help us understand how we can transform our thinking, transform our paradigm of looking at prior learning, for example, in order to achieve the spirit of what we see in the global convention.
Um, so thank you, Joanne. And I just want to point out one other thing, because you were asking Noah about resources. And one of the things that we discovered working, we have a 54 member network as part of Credential as You Go. And as we were working with educational systems and institutions, what they were asking for the most was resources. Help us understand what we can do. They wanted resources around, making the case and how to create the credentials, how to do prior learning. And so when you go to our website, you will find a whole section on tools and resources. And I think there's 14 playbooks there right now. And in thinking, and we've had a lot of conversations with lots of different people across globally, talking about prior learning and thinking about recognizing and I think I mentioned this to you recently, Joanne. I was interviewing people that were doing direct services with individuals, assessing their learning. And the majority of the people that I interviewed were approaching this from a very kind of standard way of thinking about it. There is this course, there are these learning outcomes, there are these competencies, and then having the individual prove themselves that they have that knowledge. And very few were going back to, I think, what are the roots of prior learning assessment, where we really think about how to help somebody reflect about their learning and thinking about how to bring all of their learning into, let's say, an educational environment. So we have, in a kind of developed in a traditional way, getting in some ways very mechanistic with the process, thinking about, okay, here you have to match this up. And that messages to students and individuals that whatever doesn't match is not valid. And that's not the message that we want out there. What we want to be able to do is really think about how we can credential all types of learning, and then also say, okay, when your learning aligns over here, we can say you have this course equivalent or a credential equivalent, but you also have this other learning over here. And so we have a tendency of blocking ourselves and saying it has to match what we've already got existing and nothing else. And the way education is evolving, that's not going to work all the way. It's very valid to say somebody has equivalent knowledge to a course or to a credential, but it is not, I don't think, and I'll be very blunt here, I don't think it is helpful for people to then say, that doesn't exist, which is really the message that we're going with.
Mm-hmm. And when I see your comment in the chat, David, and when I'm thinking about rethinking how to transform the recognition of learning so that we can embrace lifelong learning, you've worked for years with partners around the world talking about how to set up systems in order to support their business processes and so on. Do you have some insights from that experience? Because I was reading an article the other day about how so much of this other learning is not necessarily in systems that allow it to be brought forward in a quality assured, evident way sometimes. So there's all kinds of nuances under that cover. Can you comment on that space a little bit, David?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I appreciate you giving me the time to address it. I think part of our challenge in our world today is we've moved to a transactional model, very focused on efficiency, leveraging technology for that purpose, and obviously trying to wring out whatever costs there are so we have the most profit, regardless of whether you're a not-for-profit or for-profit. That's still the motive, is to try and use the automation as a vehicle to scale. And the challenge we have in the digital world today, as we move further and further into AI and leveraging that's technology based that we see emerging, is to embrace the concepts that Nan is mentioning and Noah, you're addressing as well, which is how do we embrace the individuality of each person and how we can leverage it in a much more connected way. It moves us away from that transactional model. But in order to do that, we have to leverage the reuse in technology, not reinvent. So our challenge has always been that many in higher education have been rewarded over decades about reinventing and improving upon something. But now we're in a world where we really need to leverage what everyone else is doing and learn from each other. So ever since I've been doing this for 50 years and I got involved in the Rome Student Group, for example, we traveled nation to nation trying to visit, understanding what's going on in Poland, what's going on in Italy, what's going on in South Africa. Each country has beautiful practices in developing it and then sharing the best of it all, which is why I think we have Groningen. I mean, the Groningen Declaration is to try and develop practices that we can all share and not keep on reinventing. Like I kind of joked with people about the concept. Everywhere I go, it's a different electrical socket, a different USB port, a different thing that we go and you say, what does it really generate in the benefit to the world if we keep changing everything we do underneath the surface? So to me, reinforcing from the insight perspective, the reuse and the principles of it means we have to give up a little bit on the reinvention and focus on trying to develop the pipelines that we need to have across the entire world and recognizing learning is very individualistic, not transactional. So
I think that for me speaks to the essence of transformational approaches, where we're sort of reflecting on, and you used a great metaphor the other day of the roast, Nan.
Yeah.
I actually want you to share that here with our audience because it is an easy one to sort of hang your hat on, if you wouldn't mind, because it cuts to those assumptions and approaches.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, this is a little story. And a granddaughter and her mother, so mother and daughter, were in the kitchen preparing dinner and they were preparing a roast. And the mother cuts off an end of the roast before putting it in the pan and sets that other piece aside. And her daughter goes, Mom, why do you keep cutting off the end of the roast? Why do you do that? And she goes, Well, actually, I don't know. That's how, Grandma always did it. Well, Grandma was in the other room, so they went into the living room where Grandma was, and it was like, Grandma, why did you always cut off the end of the roast? And Grandma said, Well, because my pan wasn't big enough. So I think this really gets into the that what David was talking about in terms of that transactional piece, where we're not saying throw away the way we've been doing things. We have so many good people who've been doing enormous amount of work around the world. But what we need to be thinking about is, do we cut off the end of the roast because that's always the way we've done it? Do we, turn it into that transactional, or do we really think about the effectiveness of this? So, one of my mentors, Morris T. Keaton, who created the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, he had always talked about the balance of the thinking about the effectiveness and the and thinking about um, the impact. So it's not just, is it being, are we being efficient? So it's kind of the balance of effectiveness and efficiency. And I think we get caught in that efficiency piece and forget about the effectiveness piece.
right.
The other thing that I wanted to mention, because David was talking about all this wonderful work that's around the world. I'm also one of the founding co-editors of a journal called Prior Learning Assessment Inside Out, PLAO, and I'll put the link to that in there. And it is an international online open source journal, really looking at the recognition of learning. And our latest issue, which will be coming out at the beginning of November, is looking at what's happening around the world in terms of recognizing the knowledge and skills of refugees, migrant workers, and displaced people. And some of the work that's happening in that sphere, we're not talking about, some of it is academic in terms of becoming a student, but we're also talking about being able to recognize people, and helping them transition from where they've been, and then recognizing the knowledge and their abilities, and then helping them think about where they're going. And so one of the things that happens in this transactional space, which I think is very limiting, is that we're constantly focused on, okay, what do you know? And what does that match up to? And, what can we equivalent that? But we tend to stop thinking about that lifelong learning piece. So as people are moving through their life, they're continually learning. How do we constantly go back and help them be recognized for that learning? And then also, how do we turn this into a way of thinking about pathways, thinking about how people can take what they know and then figure out, where they need, what's next for them. And so thinking about it as a whole person along a lifelong pathway versus this one slice in their life.
So, Noah, with the work you're doing with UNESCO, you're all over the world. It's getting ratified. You have the local conventions as well. How do we bridge that gap between the richness locally and the opportunities through engagement more broadly? Or can you give us some examples of what our colleagues have referred to?
Yeah, happy to. But if you'll permit me, I just want to respond to a couple points that were raised. Yeah, I couldn't agree more that we probably need to rethink our approach to transformation, which too readily jumps to reinvention. I mentioned working on a UNESCO Futures of Education project previously, and as part of that, trying to encourage people to do very future-oriented strategic thinking, we found that it was very useful to begin, before you get to reinvention, okay, to begin with a question about what we do now that should be continued, right? What it is that works in higher education or whatever level of education you're thinking about, maybe needs to be safeguarded, maybe needs to be protected. But I mean, to a point David was making earlier, there's a lot we know how to do well, and we need to leverage it, right? And I mean, even if that roast, with the piece cut off, shouldn't have been cut off, I mean, we need to, that suggests we need to be intentional about it, right? We need to think, what makes this work? So begin from that point. Second point is then to think about, all right, what are we doing now that we need to abandon, right? What do we need to move away from, that's getting in the way of us achieving together what we want to achieve together. And then third, I understand your point, David. I mean, I think there are probably places where we do want to reinvent some of our practices. So, as long as we've done those first two thought exercises, then I think we're heading into a transformational approach that's going to serve well. Now to answer the question you asked, Joanne, sorry. Thanks for
Well, maybe,
repeating that.
no, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe I'll actually use refugees as a specific example, bridging off what Nan said. We all know that, displaced persons, refugees face particular recognition challenges often. The most immediate ones that people go to, involve lack of complete documentation. But there's also other barriers you need to think about, that crop up when people have different statuses in new countries, are facing cultural barriers, language barriers. There's a whole bunch of gender sort of based barriers as well. So, I mean, how can you work on it? And I look forward to, devouring what you were just describing, Nan. At UNESCO, we're fortunate that all of these recognition conventions, and this, of course, is by design, not just fortune, have specific provisions, requiring that the procedures available for recognition be equally applied and equally available to refugees and displaced persons, right? And in fact, we're in the process for the Global Convention of developing a subsidiary guidance text that will, give both national authorities and institutions and credential evaluators guidance on best practices. And, ultimately, recognition decisions are made in very local contexts. But I think what, makes UNESCO's work and the GDN network's work, so convergent is this commitment to, what? We do know some good ways to do this, right? We have best practices that we should, propagate, of course, further develop, of course, contextualize, right? But there are things we know, and we need to lean into them and safeguard them and take them forward. And I think we can point to a lot of successes. We have a UNESCO qualifications passport that's been very successful in some refugee and refugee settings, conflict affected settings. There's the European qualifications recognition passport. There's a whole network of instruments and mechanisms, many of which have been completely mainstreamed in credential recognition practices that we can lean into. So I think that's exactly how we, as UNESCO, we bridge the normative work, that is very policy upstream, let's say, with the actual work of people who are evaluating credentials.
So the one thing I want to mention to my audience, I encourage you in the chat to also share examples and links that you have. Do make sure you don't just share it with the host and panelists. You can click on everyone in the chat so that all can benefit with the exemplar examples that many of you have, because I know some of you in the audience and I know the work you're doing, and I want to make sure your work is also included. We will take those links and include them in a resource on recognition that we're building as a case on the GDN website, along with the others that my panelist colleagues are sharing. David, I'm going to, and this is to both you and Nan, so I don't know who wants to go first, but you must know of some exemplar research or exemplars out there that you've hit. If you say the chat is disabled, forgive me, folks. You can put it into the Q&A and then I'll just answer it live so that you can get the links. But to my colleagues, Nan and David, you must know of some interesting examples out there, research or people doing interesting things. Is there any, not to put you on the spot, but is there any that comes to mind where you think they might be getting closer to that balance of recognizing all learning as part of their assessment practice? Who would like to go first? David?
I can go first and then I'll turn it over to Nan. I wanted to make a couple statements, though, kind of wrapping it all together a little bit. First off, work is learning and learning is work, and the two need to connect. And so when we talk about our practices, which are, put technology aside for a second, the connection, for example, of the power of working from a student perspective to a graduate perspective. Today in higher education in many parts of the world, we've abdicated our responsibility to say, we'll offload it to somebody else to verify credentials, for example. To me, it should be something embraced, because if we can connect to the employers that are hiring our graduates and stay connected, it's all part of the ecosystem. And so we've lost sight of sometimes these connections are so powerful. My first set of systems I built was from enrollment to development, from alumni development. And the power of having it shareable enables both the enrollment side and the development and everything in between, the journey of connecting it together and not creating them as silos. So our challenge has always been, because of our focus and our silo mentality, because it's very hard to do everything all at the same time. So part of this process is building practices that understand and scope how we balance it all. But to me, some of the common practices that we've evolved to, again, going back to efficiency and transactional models, well, we can offload that. And when the process of offloading it, we've lost sight of the effectiveness of moving the fact that, hey, wait a minute, someone's asking me about, did they graduate? Well, yeah, I can confirm that and find out where they potentially are thinking about going. And that connection is so powerful. Again, I just think that we should never have lost sight of that. Going back to your original question, though, build a system back in 2005. It's called collegetransfer.net. And it's a free system for transfer students to find issues and questions about mobility. It today serves about 1.6 million people, about 10,000 what I call passports. That's a reusable term many people have used for portability of learning. They come in, they put their assertions of learning in, they can do a transfer map to potential receiving institutions that would like to be accepting and welcoming to them. Well, that generated a huge population to study. So we've taken 50,000 passports, for example, and look at them. We open up an 800 number. We start opening up, and we've done this behind the scenes over years to understand the nuances of what are they looking for? Why are they coming to our website versus go directly to an institution's website? What are they shopping for? What are the nuances? What are they truly misunderstanding about? Well, how they say it's seamless, but it's not seamless, terms of transfer and mobility. So there's a lot to potentially using the data that we have, but it has to be rich enough and structured enough for us to do that, which then goes back to not reinventing the wheel, trying to leverage what's been built over the years of time that we've had computing. So I'm going to stop there because I know Nan probably has a lot more research on it, but we've done internal research with the data that we have from the portals we've been powering, because all the analytics are very powerful and instructive to help us understand not just what the learner's doing, but what are they looking at to try and understand how they're shopping for that experience of where they want to go next. So
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, David. And Nan, do you have some examples?
Yeah, so I think what I'll do is start with 3 examples and then talk a little bit about our research. So these examples come from institutions within our 54 member network. There's 3 that I think are really important concepts. One is that an institution has been working directly with employers and creating credentials that align to different levels of employment. And so they've created these integrated work and learning maps for the students, where if you get this, they call them micro credentials there. If you get this micro credential, you qualify with this employer for this job. And if you get the second one, you then qualify for that next level job. And it goes on up, and they have these maps for students to really see how they can progress and that it relates directly to the work. Another one was where we actually had multiple institutions start to embed certifications within the curriculum. What they were finding is that if they prepare the students to be ready for getting a whatever credential, the students often were not following through and getting that credential for whatever reason. And so they revamped curriculum and embedded the certifications right within the curriculum. So when they graduate, they had a credential and the industry certification at the same time. And they found that more learners were getting work directly out and being able to apply that. A third was in Credential as You Go, we started off with some research looking at different patterns of credentialing across the United States. And out of that created a framework, and that is on our website. And one area is called Retro Award, or Retro as You Go, with the idea that people have learning already. And again, we were trying to face within the United States, the way the numbers work out, 1 in 6 adults have some college and no credential. And so we were really thinking about people who already have courses under their belt, but they don't have a credential. How can we look back and start to create credentials around what they already have? And so we had quite a few different examples of institutions that developed credentials by analyzing what learners had, but had not they got so much and then didn't finish, whatever that might be. And so creating some different kinds of credentials to kind of capture that. I actually have one more I'm going to mention, which is that we had one institution that decided to do a credential on design thinking, and they looked across the curriculum and they created sort of this plan that if you had, it was an ABC menu, kind of reminds me of the old Chinese menus where you could pick from different columns. And if you had a course in the first menu, in the second menu, in the third menu, you could then have a micro-credential in design thinking because they looked about it across all industries and departments. So there's this idea of let's look across, not just down in that. In terms of our research, we've also continued in kind of two ways. One has looked at learner outcomes, and one of the things about doing data analysis is that we're based on gathering data out of existing systems which were not designed for things like prior learning assessment or small incremental credentialing or such. And so it limits what we can actually do with the data. And so with what we could do in looking at a comparative interrupted time series process, that there weren't any differences in terms of persistence and completion for learners who went through these smaller ones than bigger ones. Then the other thing that we're looking at that though is that there's a richness of all kinds of information that traditional research methods cannot capture. So we're in the midst of designing some research that's starting to look at how we can use more AI-driven analyses, things like random forests and neural networks and such, just to be able to bring together all these different aspects of what the data has. The other part of the research is really looking at practice. And we have a couple reports on, different kinds of practices that we see. But one of the things that we also heard from our constituents is that they really wanted help with being able to assess kind of like where they are, that a lot of them are in the middle of their practices, but they're kind of like, what are we doing and how does that kind of stack up and how do we plan the next thing? And so out of that research, we have pulled together a tool, and that actually is supposed to be released next week. And it will be announced on our website. The idea is it is a self-assessment and planning tool for institutions to be really thinking about incremental credentialing.
I love that. I'm going to look at it quite closely once it launches then. There's a couple of other call outs that I want to do. One is, I believe it was NewFit created a tool online where you could actually, on the input side, take a micro-credential, for example, and then analyze its components to determine how much it could be trusted. Because I think that's the other piece is all this lifelong learning is done in different places and spaces. And so how do we make sure that it's relatively quality assured, et cetera, fit to purpose. And there's another one I want to mention, which is sorry, I'm just looking aside here, the European Digital Education Hub. I encourage people to take a look at that. We'll put the link up on our website. There's some incredible work going on in Europe. And I have an opportunity next week to dive a little deeper there, where it's looking at how to extend the universe in a way that's standards-based so that we can start to bring together opportunities for learners and their pathways and so on. So it's a very interesting space. They've done some very thorough work on use case design and so on. I want to ask a question of all of you. And I see as well people are being very generous in the Q&A with some of their examples. There was an West example that we put forward, and Susan from Thompson Rivers has created, so I'll just pop it out to all of you because it gives a flavor of some of the good work that you're doing in our audience. So I encourage you to keep bringing those forward. It's helpful for us as we go on. I want to look on the output side now because I'm looking at our audience. And some of our audience members have to do credential evaluation for regulators. Some of them are supporting regulators. Some of them have to do it for entry into an institution or entry beyond entry for transfer. So there's that different purpose that people are doing credential evaluation as well as looking at or not different forms of prior learning. It's a bit of a complex array of circumstances, maybe I'll start with Noah and I'll ask you this. Putting you on the spot a little bit, but does the convention and its work contemplate fit to purpose and in this space? And is this an area of further exploration, or have they already built in some thinking around this? And how are they working with its communities to help bring in these other forms of learning into the house, shall we say? Whether it's
Sure.
for regulators, for work, or for education
Yeah.
purposes.
No, I appreciate the question. I mean, whenever we get into conversations about, fit for purpose, I always think it's important to start with the question of the fitness of the purpose, right? So what is the purpose? And that's really in one way what your question is getting at. What are the outcomes? What are the purposes that this serves? So, I mean, I've already spoken a bit about the learner-centered focus of UNESCO's work. So maybe I take this opportunity to talk about how we see qualifications recognition serving a bunch and higher education with it, right? Serving a bunch of other really important social purposes. One you just alluded to, Joanne, it's the ways that we can enhance employability of higher education graduates, the ways that we can enhance pathways to decent work, right? So that and Nan gave examples of this, of course, too, right? So that, students, learners, employers know that people are equipped with job-specific skills. And then, of course, that plays a key role in reducing unemployment, underemployment, and skills mismatches. Those are problems we see the world over, and we need some ways to address them. And our work in qualifications recognition is intended to support that. A second, I mean, I think we also, when we think about, the purpose here, the outcomes, I think we are looking at some structural and economic transformations. I mean, I think that this is a way to work towards just transformation. It's a way to work towards circular economies. As universities make their programming, make their degrees, make their learning experiences, whether they're micro-credentials or what have you, make their research, as they make all of that, more attuned to local economies, local social, economic issues, that makes them more powerful more able to intervene and shape and direct, right? So at UNESCO, we think a lot about greening higher education as one of the routes to greening economies the world over. Third, though, not all the jobs exist, and we need to promote entrepreneurship, right? And, I think that, when we think about fostering entrepreneurial skills, allowing individuals to start businesses, to stimulate local economies, I mean, I think there's a lot that can be advanced, particularly when we bring in questions about recognition of prior learning, partial study, just to see that there are a lot of different pathways to becoming, a productive and successful contributor to, provisioning for one's family, one's community, one's country, one's region, etc. And then, I mean, the final point I'd like to mention is, I think for all of us, one of the key purposes that we're trying to advance is a strong social inclusion purpose, right? Education, educational institutions, programs, learning opportunities, there needs to be equitable access, equitable, affordable access, right? We can't leave the cost out of the picture. This is, I think, one of the key ways that we provision economic opportunities for marginalized groups. It's one of the key ways we reduced inequality. I think it's how we address global disparities, and it's how we all stand together around, a commitment to inclusive, sustainable growth. So just to sort of throw those like larger social objectives into the picture of what the work of everyone on this call is contributing to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to pull one of the threads, which it talks about the government levers, for example. And I see Michael on the call. We have in Canada the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. which actually helps with moving across 13 provinces and territories, credentialed, regulated professions, shall we say. An example being the teaching profession, where if you're fully certified in one province or territory, that will be recognized in another province and territory. And I say this, it's extraordinary, really, that that exists because it overlays provincially based and territorially based legislation and acts and so on, and complex procedures that are aligned but different, very different. And it's a layer of detail and complexity that is really fascinating to me when you talk about moving people to a place of determining substantial difference versus doing assessment based on inputs. So that that regulation, if you will, that Canadian Free Trade Agreement um, concept that you is a good example of what you alluded to and one of your points. And I think, Michael, if you're still on the call, if you could share the link to that, I'd be grateful because I think it's a good illustrative example of how to balance the local needs, et cetera, with the broader needs, which, by the way, came out of the good work of organizations like the Council of Minister of Education Canada, which is a collegium, if you will, a consortium of all the different ministries of education that are differently governed. So there's probably other illustrative examples, and I thank you for that, Michael. David, go ahead, Nan. You had a point you wanted to chime in with.
Yes, I would. Thank you. I want to pick up on Noah's comment about the fitness of the purpose. And it really brings me back to some work I've been doing recently to talk about what is recognition? What do we even mean by that? And when we start to talk about recognizing people for what they know and can do, there's kind of two parts to that. One is that as a human need, we need to be recognized. That's part of our human nature. And as we start to look at the power structures of institutions or industries to be thinking about that, what are we going to recognize? How are we going to recognize what it's, we often build in partial recognitions. We don't fully recognize people. And thinking about that fitness, I think is a very, very important thing in terms of are our policies and practices really fit for what we're trying to do? And I think that's something that we all need to take into great consideration. And as a result, I'm going to do one shout out for Susan Forsell, who's on there, because at Thompson Rivers University, they've been doing some amazing work working with their Indigenous communities to rethink the whole PLAR process from an Indigenous way of knowing. And so I think we need to take our time to stop and think about these practices and think about, is it fitting the purpose? Are we really able to do what we're saying that we're doing? And do we need to frame it in different ways?
That's a good point. And in fact, there's an international Indigenous accreditation organization that's been working globally with local partners. I was at an Australian event where they were sharing about how they are changing the paradigm in this space to recognize traditional practices of ways in knowing and doing, and self-accrediting in a way that is being respected by traditional infrastructures. And I know in Ontario, the ONCAD has been doing a lot of work with the Indigenous community in some of this space differently, but still, as has the ministry. So there's good examples around the world. Noah, you wanted to chime in, so.
Yeah, just really quickly to say, I mean, the example you brought up from Canada, mentioning Michael, yeah, and also the example from Indigenous communities, I mean, underscores for me the importance of trust, information
Mhm.
sharing and cooperation, and dare I say, solidarity also being the guiding principles that motivate us. I mean, I think that's what, an organization like the GDN network does so well, is create this community of practice that accelerates trust. I think it's through trust that we do the kind of recognition work that serves individuals and societies. Back over to you. Thanks for
So
letting me come in.
oh, thank you for the
After
shout
that,
out. It's always appreciated. David, I
well,
want to give you a chance to chime in here.
No, and Noah, I'm glad you brought that up because I coined it a long time ago. Do we have vitamin T? And vitamin T meant trust. Trust is really the backbone of prior learning assessment and recognition. And what we're trying to do, whether it's in hiring somebody or trying to engage them in the enrollment process, it's do we trust what is being said and how they say it? Do they trust how the document is exchanged? Do we trust the document itself or the electronic artifact that's being shared? Trust is the fabric of it all. And it's like we want to trust the product we buy is going to serve my purpose. So to me, trust is central to the theme that we're talking about. And I'm glad you brought that up, Noah.
Mm.
Nan, did you want to put a final comment around some of this?
Well, I totally agree with my colleagues, David and Noah. The trust and also that solidarity. I mean, what are we really trying to do here?
All right.
And why do we have to compete against each other or not trust each other? I've never been able to understand why we wouldn't trust another colleague and their ability to make assessments as being any better or worse than my own. It's like we're all trying to do the best that we can. And I think it's time that we take down those barriers.
So we've talked today about some of those barriers. We've talked about not all of them. Noah did this with his hands. There's business models, there's regulations, there's local policies, institutional policies, there's regulatory bodies. So we're not going to be able to boil the ocean today, but we are getting a flavor of some of the threads as we think about how to transform credential assessment practice so that we're embracing the multiple forms of learning that someone brings forward. I want to highlight the global recognition comment that Noah made about how important it is to move from a place of looking at inputs only or at all and focusing on trying to establish, instead of how much does it match, where are the points of difference, those substantial difference pieces? Is there enough in here that someone could perhaps be successful and have a chance? And where are the gaps and how do we help them fill those gaps as we're going forward? This requires advocacy locally with regulatory bodies, with academic leaders, with institutions, with organizations, and with government. We've talked about how government levers can help to advance change by using, for example, the CFTA example in Canada, et cetera. There are many other examples. I want to thank our audience for sharing them today. I want to thank our panelists for joining us. We will have more of these kinds of sessions. And in fact, Noah has kindly put in the chat one tomorrow for UNESCO as they work to build awareness and knowledge. Noah's also kindly agreed to come to our conference, GDN conference in Oslo from October the 29th to the 31st this coming fall. And we're excited about that. So I'm going to ask Amalia to put the link in the chat if she hasn't already for that and for our audience. We look forward to having many of you. David and others will be presenting on some innovations. And I saw, Nan, you have an upcoming webinar as well that I'm hoping to tap into and see. And she's come back a couple of times now to help us. And thank you as well to all of you and to UNESCO colleagues for their help at our May convening, which we did in Toronto. And many of you and the Canadians on the call and some Americans and others were able to attend. The one in Europe and Oslo is international, and we'll have many more webinars coming down the pipeline for you. On behalf of the GDN, thank you so much for listening today. As a reminder, we will be putting this taping up on our recognition case study page, which Amalia will be looking after. On behalf of our audience, thank you, colleagues, for sharing your expertise. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.